Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we are entering a new section of our expose of The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. We have moved on to a section called The Truth, Part 2 of The One Thing, all about the truth, the simple path to productivity. If you guys remember the last few episodes, we were covering part 1 of the book, which was the lies that they tell you about success. So, for example, like last episode, we talked about how big is about balance and the lie about discipline, all these things. Well, now starting to get a little more positives, things. So we are going to start off with this chapter 10, called The Focusing Question. The Focusing Question, which we have kind of touched on earlier in the book, and I'll just move ahead to the first slide here. We've kind of touched on this question earlier in the book on, what was the question? Nope, wait, I do remember it. What is the one thing that by doing that one thing, it makes everything else easier? That was the question that we were asking ourselves earlier in the book that Gary had posed to us. And everything kind of stems from that question. Everything that you do stems from that question. You don't have to worry about making lists, a little busy list. No, you just ask yourself that one question, leads you to your one answer, and that's what you should be doing because it makes everything else easier. So at the beginning of chapter 10 here, again, the focusing question, Andrew Carnegie is being quoted here by Gary. He had this address on June 23rd, 1885 at Curry Commercial College. And his address ended up being entitled The Road to Business Success, I guess because this was heavily quoted, it was heavily publicized, it was a very famous speech, so naturally it's going to get a title, okay? And I won't read the whole thing here, not the whole speech, but Gary has a passage in here from the speech, but I think the most important part is towards the end of the passage that Gary quotes, which is, they have investments in this or that or the other, here, there, and everywhere. Don't put all your eggs in one basket is all wrong. I tell you, put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that one basket. Look round you and take notice. Men who do that do not often fail. It is easy to watch and carry the one basket. It is trying to carry too many baskets that breaks most eggs in this country. And I think that's where this focusing question comes in. That's where the focusing question comes into play. And gosh, pardon my typo there on the slide. Life is a question. So if you want a great answer, Gary says the quality of the answer is determined by the quality of the question. And it is said that you judge a man by his questions rather than his answers, said Voltaire one time. And Sir Francis Bacon said a prudent question is one half of wisdom. Judge a man by his questions. The question is going to drive you. And again, we want to make it a good question, a good focusing question. And we're going to get to that at the very end there. You can see in the red, what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? So I kind of had it. I was close earlier, but that's the actual focusing question that you want to be asking yourself. Just a couple other bullet points here. Asking questions can improve learning and performance by potentially 150%. This was something that Gary cites. There was a Harvard Law School questions engage our critical thinking. Research shows that asking questions improves learning and performance by as much. He doesn't really quote the the actual study there. Wouldn't surprise me if it's from Stanford, because all the other research that he has quoted from in this book thus far, a lot of it has been from Stanford, so wouldn't be surprised. But I do this when I'm really focused on a task, really focused on something. I ask myself questions. I'm like talking to myself the whole time that I'm like really delving deep into a piece of work, like a story that I'm doing at work, a coding story, that is. And I'm constantly talking to myself, like asking myself questions. Oh, what if I do this? What if I do this? Because it's leading me down a path. And if the path doesn't end up working, then, well, that leads to other questions where hopefully then I can find the right path. And I love this story. I've heard the story before. This next bullet point, My Wage by J.B. Ritt. The famous line from this: I worked for a menial's hire only to learn dismayed that any wage I had asked of life would have willingly paid. So this is kind of hearkening back to that thing that we were talking about, I believe, in Big is Bad in the previous episode on, on where you set that threshold. And I heard a quote before that, there's a tragedy in setting a threshold too low and you exceeding it versus setting the threshold too high and you don't quite hit it. And we gave the example about basketball. You set a goal of 40 points, you only hit 30 versus you set a goal of 10 points and you get to 20. Well, in the end, you scored more points, but you didn't reach your goal. So anyway, you got to ask yourself the right questions. You got to set the right thresholds. Ask the right questions. So what's so great about this focusing question? Well, the one thing that's great about it is that if you break it down, it's both a small focus. It's answering both a small focus question and a big picture question simultaneously. Your one thing is like the bigger picture. Or more so like maybe even the everything else. But the small picture, okay, the small picture is the one thing. What's the one thing you can do right now? That's the smaller time frame, but everything else would be easier and necessary. That's in the long run, everything. That's the bigger picture. And what the question is doing is it's setting yourself up for a domino effect. Because after completing every one thing that you ask of yourself, well, now it requires a new focusing question and a new domino to potentially fall from there. Let me go to the next slide. So this is where Gary breaks down the anatomy of the question and why this is the phrasing of the focusing question in this chapter is so critical, because first off, there's the first part. What's the one thing I can do? And this is where you break it down to one thing, not that to-do list, which we talked about before in the lies when we talked about multitasking. What's the one thing I can do? And notice it's one thing versus many things. There's many things you should do or can do, could do. Or excuse me, what you should do, could do, but what can you do? What's the one thing you can do? That's the spark. And then part two, such that by doing it, Gary says that this is kind of the bridge between doing something and doing something for a purpose. By doing it. This tells you there's a criterion your answer must meet. It's the bridge between doing something and doing something for a specific purpose. It lets you know you're going to have to dig deep, like Ronnie Coleman, got to dig deep. And then the third part, everything else will be easier or unnecessary, the ultimate leverage test. Leverage, so like you've got a long lever, it's easier to move the boulder. Less effort to get closer and ultimately accomplishing your goal. That's what is accomplished when you complete your one thing. makes everything else easier. That's leverage right there. You ever hear that term? Like some people are over leveraged, right? Under leveraged as like a financial term. But there's one thing out there that by doing it's going to make everything else easier. Case in point, with me today, and I mean recording this right now, I asked myself the question, okay, what's the one thing that I can be doing right now? Okay, I can get an episode out for the viewers. That would make other things easier because then I don't have to worry about doing it tomorrow where I have a lot of stuff going on. And then when I put it off to tomorrow and I don't get to it, well, now I'm stressing out that I've like wasted a day because I haven't recorded anything. So that's the question that I asked of myself. It made everything else easier by doing this today. So those are the 3 parts of it. And these were the big ideas from the chapter. Guys, this was a shorter chapter. Very short chapter on the focusing question. So just to summarize, again, if you want great answers, you got to have great questions. And the ultimate question that you should be asking yourself that Gary writes is this focusing question that we have talked about before. What is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? And we really broke it down on how that is a double duty question. It's both a small focusing question and a bigger picture question. The smaller picture, the smaller time frame is the right now. What can I be doing right now? What's my one thing that I can do right now that makes everything else easier? Everything else being the bigger picture. So it's answering a small and a bigger picture question. What's my one thing? Small focus question, what's my one thing right now? And ultimately, you ask of yourself, the way I look at this is you ask of yourself these focusing questions that are under the umbrella of a big picture focusing question. If you guys see what I'm saying. So, yes, there's an ultimate goal that you have, but to get to that goal, you got to ask yourself all these other smaller questions. And those are the right nows. What can I be doing right now? What domino can be the first to fall right now? That's going to do it. Guys, thank you so much for listening. We'll be back in the next episode with Chapter 11, The Success Habit. So tune in next time for that. And guys, I really appreciate you listening. Thank you so much. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.